Well, today we are starting to wind down in this series we've been in for a couple of months now, where we've been exploring the life of Moses. And really, we haven't even we're like barely scratching the surface of Moses' life. We've covered like the first half of the book of Exodus, and Moses is going to be around for, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so at some point, we'll probably do a part 2 or maybe 3 or 4 of this series. But this feels like a natural stopping point for where we're at for a number of reasons. But one of those is that up until this point, the book of Exodus moves at like breakneck speed, right? Like all of a sudden the Israelites are enslaved and Pharaoh's killing babies. And so this one woman gives birth and puts her son in the reeds where he's discovered by Pharaoh's daughter and she adopts him. Boom, time jump 40 years. Moses kills a man, goes out to the wilderness. Boom, time jump another 40 years. Moses meets God in the wilderness. He confronts Pharaoh. There's 10 plagues. All of a sudden they cross through the Red Sea. That's been event after event after event. And then now things slow way down. In fact, where we left off last week, what's going to happen is that by the time we get to Exodus chapter 19, the people are on Mount Sinai, and they're going to stay on Mount Sinai for the rest of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers. Okay, so everything is going to slow way down. But what I want to do today would be really easy to just end our series last week after they crossed through the Red Sea and say, isn't that great? But I actually think there's a lesson for us today in these chapters leading up to the Israelites getting to Mount Sinai, because they've just had this great momentous event, right? They've seen God deliver the plagues. He's rescued them through the Red Sea, and we're getting ready to head to Mount Sinai, but they have these chapters in between where they are making their way from the sea to Sinai, and they find themselves in what people call a liminal space. A liminal space is really just when you're not in one season, but you're not quite in this next season yet. So for example, in ancient cultures, they might take young boys and send them out into the wilderness for 30 days. And so they leave the community as a boy and they come back as a man. But when they're in the wilderness, that's a liminal space. It's oftentimes a season of testing, a season of transformation. And I think it's a season that if you're not in one of those right now, you will be at some point in your life. Maybe it's in between jobs. Maybe you're approaching getting married. You're about to have kids. We're in these liminal spaces. We're not quite what we used to be. We're not quite what God is shaping us into. And those tend to be seasons of testing. And what we're going to see today is that the Israelites in this liminal space between the Red Sea and Sinai, they're no longer enslaved, but they're not yet a nation. And what God is going to do is he's going to give them a series of tests. I think sometimes we talk about testing and we think, well, that's not really fair that God would test us. And it has a negative connotation. But I know we've got some teachers here this morning, and when teachers give tests, what are they doing? They're trying to help you realize what is true. Because if you ask your students, do you understand the material? Most of them will probably say yes. But when you give them the test, you will realize what is true. Did they actually know the material or did they not? And when God gives tests to his people, it's not because he's punishing them. He's trying to help reveal what is true. And in order for us to understand these tests, I want to kind of go back and hit on one point that Greg made last week. Greg did a phenomenal job talking about the crossing of the Red Sea, but I want to kind of expand on one of the points he made that I think will give shape to what we're looking at here in the testing today. So you remember, Greg talked about the fact that the Israelites were supposed to leave Egypt and head to Mount Sinai, but God didn't take them the most direct route because they would encounter enemies that might discourage them and they would head back to Egypt. So he takes them kind of this roundabout way where they get to the Red Sea. Interestingly enough, the Old Testament's written in Hebrew, and in Hebrew it's not called the Red Sea. It's the Sea of Reeds. And we only call it the Red Sea because when the Old Testament was translated into Greek, they translated reed as red, and so we call it the Red Sea. We don't actually exactly know where this crossing took place, but I think there's some symmetry there, because remember, when Moses was a baby, he was placed in a basket and settled into the reeds. Like Moses' mom just didn't put him in a basket and push him down the river and hope something good happened. She set him in the reeds, and he was delivered and rescued out of the reeds. And in the same way, God's people are about to be delivered and rescued out of the reeds. And so they get there, and they're looking at this impossible task. How are we going to get through the Sea of Reeds? We have Pharaoh's armies bearing down behind us, and they think this is an impossible situation, and they begin to complain. Moses, why did you bring us out here? You should just let us die in Egypt. And there's so many things we could talk about, but one that stands out to me is they thought they were in an impossible situation, which they were. They were going to have to rely on God. You ever hear that phrase, God doesn't give you more than you can handle? He absolutely gives you more than you can handle, but he never gives you more than he can handle. And so really it's a test for them. Where will they put their trust? What they don't realize is that's actually God's blessing for them to be there, because he could have had them go and face the enemies on the direct way. He knew that would discourage them. So even the very obstacle they're facing is God's blessing to them. It is his grace to them. And I know in my own life, I have to catch myself, because there will be times when I'm going through a difficult season in parenting, right? Which what I'm learning is every season is a difficult season in parenting. But I'm reminded when I'm tempted to sit there and complain and say, God, why are we going through this? That it could have been something different. Right? It could have been my marriage that was barely hanging on. Or maybe it is your marriage that's suffering, but at least it's not your health. Or maybe it is your health that you're hanging on to, but at least it's not your finances. Or maybe it is your finances, but there could have been something else. And it's not to minimize or say we got to fake it till we make it, but to realize that even in the battles that we face, that God will be with us, and it could have been something else. It's always a test. Where will we put our trust? In ourselves to control the situation, or in God, who's the only one who will be able to deliver them? And they're sitting there complaining, which is also interesting, because wasn't it a few chapters earlier that we heard God had heard their cries? God, would you please save us? Would you please rescue us? And in the process of rescuing, they say, we want to go back. They're complaining about the very thing that they were praying for. I know I have to be careful about this. Sometimes we get caught complaining about the thing that we used to pray for. You're complaining about the job you have now, which was the thing you prayed for years. You complain about your spouse, and how long did you spend praying that God would give you a spouse? You're complaining about this situation and that situation, but those are God's blessings to us. It does not mean that everything's always easy. It does not mean that everything's always great. But will we complain or will we worship? And so Moses intercedes on the people's behalf, and God starts to part the waters. And here's the point that I want to kind of elaborate on. The beginning of the Bible, remember, everything in Exodus is a callback to Genesis. When the Bible tells the story of creation, it says the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the watery depths. So when Genesis talks about the creation story, it doesn't speak of God creating something out of nothing. Now, there's other parts in the Bible that speak to that. But in the creation story, we have this picture of the waters of chaos, and God starts to bring form and function to what is there. And it actually says he separates the waters from the land, right? He's actually bringing dry ground out of the water. And in the Exodus story, it's significant that when the waters part, the Israelites pass through on dry ground. What we're supposed to take away is that this is about to be a new creation, right? Israel's whole identity has been they are slaves, and now God is creating something new, giving them a new identity. And when they cross through the waters, it is an act of God saying, I'm about to do something new in this group of people. And so they get across to the other side, and then the waters come crashing down on their enemies. And in chapter 15, their response is to worship. And I think this is so interesting because God did not tell them, I want you to worship me because of what I just did. But the natural reaction for what God had done in their life, they could not help but to worship, to offer thanks and praise to God. This is their natural reaction. Notice this, they were standing at the waters on one side and it was impossible. But as they stand and look back over the waters, they're full of thanks and praise to God. And I think, listen, I saw this online. A church had posted this sign, keep Christ in Thanksgiving. I was like, all right, guys, we have lost the plot. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And I don't even necessarily think, Thanksgiving has its roots in the Christian faith. But as people who follow Jesus, we follow a God who's constantly telling us, remember when I did this. Remember when I was faithful before. And I think this attitude and this idea that we would set aside time to look back over what seemed like impossible situations and to thank God for how he delivered us, like that absolutely is part of what it looks like to follow Jesus. And that we get to set aside time this week to look back over the last year and all the seas that God parted, all the ways that he showed up, even when we were complaining, even when we didn't deserve it, and how faithful he was to us. And we get to celebrate that with an attitude of thanksgiving. So I'm not telling you that you have to sit around the dinner table on Thursday and everybody go around and say what they're thankful for. But I think it's absolutely appropriate for all of us to spend some time reflecting back. In fact, that's why every year at this time, we start prepping you guys for something that we do in December. On Sunday, December 10th, it's our Above and Beyond Sunday. And what that is, as a church, it's where we come together and we're going to give a financial offering above and beyond our normal tithes and offerings. And this goes to several different things. But the reason that we do this is not because, we never set a financial goal for this. That's not even what it's about. It's about, hey, over the last year, how has God been faithful to us? And our natural response ought to be thanksgiving, ought to be praise, ought to be worship. And in fact, in just a few weeks, I've learned my lesson over the years. We used to give these out in November and everybody loses them, and so we're going to wait. But in just a few weeks, you're going to get an envelope just like this, and it has a little card on it. And the card says, what's one thing I'm thankful for in 2023, and one thing I'm believing God for in 2024. And I want you to spend the next, several weeks just praying, being thankful for what God has done over the last year. Maybe even ask him what he might be calling you to do in this next year. And then whatever he asked you to give, just give that. Like I said, we never set a financial goal. That's not what this is about. We do set a participation goal, though. My hope and my prayer is that if Bridgepoint is your home church, that on that Sunday, whether there is a financial gift in this envelope or not, you would at least have what you're thankful for and what you're praying to God for, and that it would be a Sunday where, just like the Israelites are looking back and worshiping because of what God had just done, it would be a Sunday of celebration, of praise and thanks over what God has done over this last year. In fact, the other reason that we try to give you guys enough notice is I think a lot of times in churches, it can be really easy to try to manipulate people, right? Like we get up on that Sunday and we play "In the Arms of the Angel," and we're going to be emotionally manipulated into giving. No. Scripture actually says each one should give what he has decided in his heart beforehand to give. It's not about emotional manipulation. Saying, God, what would you have me give? God, I'm thankful for what you've done year, and just be obedient to what he calls you to do. If he calls you to give nothing, give nothing. Whatever he calls you to give, do that. And what do we do with this offering? Well, we take half of it and we give it away to missions. And so there's a couple ministry partners that we try to bless every single year. One of them is, whether you realize it or not, there is an entire school in Kenya of 120 students and adults who get fed every single day because of your generosity. Like every single day over the last 365 days, they've had meals because of your generosity. We have missionaries that are serving over in Southeast Asia. And they'll go into these remote villages and they go in and try to help them identify what are the needs you see. Is it clean drinking water? Is it health care? Is it education? And they actually help them build a system to address those needs. So they don't go in and dig a well. They go in and help them learn, how can I dig a well and purify the water? In fact, one of the stories I'll never forget, I was talking to them and they said they went to one of these remote villages and they were standing by this river and they had identified, clean water was like a big thing for them. So he said, okay, do you have a way to purify your water? He said, oh, yes, absolutely. So how are you purifying your water? And they pointed to a structure in the middle of the river, and they said, we throw our sacrifices in there, and the water spirits clean the water for us. And so they're talking to like the head of this village, and like his second in command's behind him, like, no, we don't have a way to get clean drinking water. And so they actually went in and helped them develop a way to purify their own water to drink. And one of the ways that we helped them is through Above and Beyond. A few years ago, we bought them a truck so that they could get to these remote places that you and I may never get a chance to go. We also have a ministry partner, Destino del Reino in Honduras. It's a children's home and children's school just for the poorest of the poor. Like if you make too much, you'll have to go to a different school, because for some of these people, the only clothes they have, the only food that they eat is through the school. In fact, we had a mission trip team go over there. Last year, we have another mission trip team we're going to send out this June. If you're interested in information on that, you can stop by the lobby. We have a flyer there where there's an informational meeting coming up in the next few weeks. And I'd love to see you go. But even if you don't go on that mission trip, when you give, your money goes places that you will never get to go. Like, you may never get to visit the school in Kenya where you're feeding people, but your money's making a difference. You may never get to go to these remote villages, but through your generosity, you've already been there. You might not be able to make it work to go on the mission trip this summer, but when you give financially, you're actually making it possible for other people to go and to make a difference. So that's what we do with half of the Above and Beyond offering. Now, we take the other half and we split it, and so we're going to take 25% of that offering, and we're going to save it because we want to make sure we're financially responsible. And the other 25% goes to like a big project that we work on here at church. The one we have decided this year is we're doing a total renovation of our kids area. So we want to make a significant investment in our next generation. I will tell you, we've already paid for the designer. They're already working on stuff. So listen, I've got vision for days. Like, we have like 5 or 6 different phases. Like, we're going to upgrade the elementary room, the preschool room, the baby rooms, check-in area. We want to take this room back here and turning it into a nursing mom's room, because you guys are having babies like the Israelites were, and you're being fruitful and multiplying, which is great. So we just want to do what we can to make an investment in the next generation. So again, I've got vision for days and days and days. So that's not the problem, but we only progress at the pace of our generosity. So as you give, we will do those projects. We do everything debt-free here. I'm a big believer in that. And so as you give, you will start to see, big changes over in that area. So all of that to say, that's coming up on December 10th. So what I want you to do is be thinking and praying. Right, God, would you have me give to this? And as you're thinking and praying, would you be filled with gratitude? Like the Israelites looking over the waters that they just came through. What are the waters that you came through this year? How had God saved you, delivered you, rescued you? And what should our response be in light of that? So the Israelites just had this test. This is all like intro to what we're talking about this week. So they've gone through this. They're supposed to be this new creation. They're praising God. They're saying, yes, you're going to fight for us. You're always going to deliver us. You've rescued us. And then immediately they're going to face 3 different tests. And the tests, remember, reveal what is true. Okay, you just said, because God has delivered you, you're going to trust in him. But will you continue to trust in him when things didn't go the way you expected? Will you continue to trust in him when life doesn't turn out the way you anticipated? And so that's where we're going to pick up Exodus chapter 15, starting in verse 22. They've just finished worshiping and praising. It says, then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur. And they journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. And they came to Marah. But they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That's why it was named Marah. The people grumbled to Moses, what are we going to drink? So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, and when he threw it into the water became drinkable. So I got a lot of ground to cover, not a lot of time. So I'm just going to make a couple quick points here about this first test they encounter. It says they leave after this worship service. They travel 3 days without finding water. Understandably, that would make you a little grumpy, right? Now, what I find interesting, they've traveled 3 days. They don't find water. Then they do find water at a place called Marah. And in Hebrew, the word for bitter is Marah. So it's like they came to Marah, but they couldn't drink the water because it was Marah. That's why it's called Marah. It's like just a one run-on sentence with Marah 1,000,000 times in it. But they have water, but they're complaining because they don't like the water that they have. Now, if you remember, when Moses and Aaron first confronted Pharaoh, do you remember what they asked him to do? They asked him, will you allow us to travel into the wilderness 3 days so we could worship God? That's what they asked for. They didn't say, let us go forever. Let us go for 3 days so we could worship. Now, they've traveled for 3 days, so what should they be doing? Worshiping. But what are they doing? They're complaining. And I wonder sometimes if maybe God has given us something that didn't meet our expectations. They have water, they don't like the water. And instead of trusting God, they complain. Instead of worshiping him, we find reasons to be bitter and to grumble. Paul in the New Testament says, do all things without grumbling and complaining. And sure, maybe it wasn't exactly what they wanted, but are we willing to worship even when things don't look the way we want? Or will we complain? Now, listen, I think there is certainly a place for lament. Lament is all over Scripture, all over the Psalms. But lament is when we look out at the brokenness of the world. When we see mass shootings, see people who die because they don't have access to basic medical care. When people don't have access to food or water, like we can look at those and say, God, this world is fundamentally broken. We lament them. We're asking you to bring justice. Lamenting is not complaining because we didn't like the taste of the water that was given to us. There's a sense where sometimes we complain just because we didn't get things the way we wanted. But here's how faithful God is. Remember, they're supposed to be trusting God. Well, will we trust for him to provide? We just saw him send 10 plagues. He just delivered us through the waters. Will we trust him to provide water? And instead they don't. They fail the test. But God is so good that he blesses the water anyway. And he tells Moses, take this tree, throw it in the water, and it changes so that it becomes sweet. And actually, they end up settling temporarily in an area, it'll say a few verses later, that had 12 springs and 70 trees. It had more than what they could possibly want. Now, this is the first of 3 tests they're going to face. The next test comes in the next chapter, chapter 16, verse 1. The entire Israelite community departed from Elim and came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had left the land of Egypt. The entire Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted. Instead, you brought us into this wilderness to make this whole assembly die of hunger. So they've already been complaining about the water. But as they leave to head to their next stop on their journey to Sinai, now they start complaining because we don't have food. And not only are they complaining, but they're saying, man, things were better for us back in Egypt. Now, do we think for a second there's any ounce of truth to that? Absolutely not. They have been praying that God would deliver them from Egypt, but now things are uncomfortable. They're in this liminal space. They're saved, but they're not quite a nation yet. And they start wanting to go back to the way things used to be. And I have found in life, a lot of times we will go back to the way things used to be, not because it was better, but because it was comfortable. But God will never grow you when you are in a comfortable place. It doesn't feel comfortable to grow. Do you remember growing pains when you were younger? It hurts and there's nothing you can do about it. I think sometimes God's trying to stretch us and grow us, but we keep wanting to head back to Egypt. He said, I've already set you free from that. Move forward. So they're grumbling and complaining. So God says, all right, I'm going to give you food. And so every morning they wake up and they're like these flakes on the ground. And it will be this bread that they call manna, which manna actually translated means what? So it's what is that? What? I don't know. It's just manna. It's on the ground. And they're supposed to go get an omer full of this, which is actually 2 quarts worth. And they say every morning you go and you get your 2 quarts worth. Don't save any, because if you try to keep it till the next day, it's going to be rotten. The worms are it's not going to keep. So just get enough for what you need for today. And guess what I'll do tomorrow? The same thing. And the next day, the same thing. And the next day, the same thing. And what's interesting is as the story unfolds here, some people would try to get more than 2 quarts, and when they end up getting back home, they only had 2 quarts. And some people got less than 2 quarts, and when they got back home, they had 2 full quarts. It's almost like God just kind of scrapes and makes sure everything's nice and even for everybody. He's providing exactly what they need every day. Undoubtedly, this is what Jesus is referencing when he says, when you pray, ask God for your daily bread. Ask him for what you need for today. Learn how to depend on him and trust him today. And then God gives another command. He said, on the 6th day, I want you to take 4 quarts. And normally I told you, it's not going to last till the next day. This time it will last until the next day. And on the 7th day, I want you to take a Sabbath. I want you to rest. Now, the Sabbath doesn't become a command until they get to Sinai in a few chapters. This is the first time we see God say, I want you to trust me. Trust me that when every other day it's not going to last. Trust me that on the 6th day it will, and that you won't work. And so I want us to jump down to verse 27. This is the test. Will they trust God to give them their daily bread? Verse 27, it says, yet on the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they did not find any. And then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and instructions? Understand that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he will give you 2 days' worth of bread. Each of you stay where you are. No one is to leave his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. So God tells them, I want you to rest on the 7th day. Now think about these people. What has their entire identity been up until just a few weeks prior to this? They are slaves, and slaves work. All they were good for is producing. And so God says, now it is time to take a rest. Again, that is God's blessing. But instead of trusting God's blessing, and instead of trusting his word, for whatever reason, I don't know if they thought maybe I just need a little extra, or maybe it was, what if he doesn't give us the bread the next day? Like we need to go out and get what we can today. For whatever reason, they do not trust. And when God tells Moses, why do you refuse to keep my commands? The you there is plural. It's like we have a word for this in the South. It's y'all, okay? He's not just talking to Moses. Like, why do you guys, I'm from the North. I can't say y'all, sorry. It's like, why do you guys not trust me? Why are you not keeping my commands? And there's so much we could even say about the Sabbath in our generation. Do we trust that if we gave God an entire day, that he would still take care of us? Do we trust that work would not fall apart if we Sabbathed? Do we trust that we would still have our financial needs met if we Sabbathed? See, to me, the Sabbath is a test of trust. And you guys know some of our life group seasons just wrapped up, and some of our groups walked through taking a Sabbath. I always say, I think in our current culture and context, this is the hardest spiritual practice to implement. Because you can pray in the car for 15 minutes. You could read your Bible at home with a cup of coffee or maybe at Starbucks, right? But to Sabbath, you're saying, I'm taking an entire day. I'm taking my most valuable resource, my time, and I'm trusting you, God, that you're going to use this and that you're going to provide for me. And here they failed the test. But even though they failed the test, God continued to feed them. For the next 40 years, every morning they woke up, there was still bread. Now you think at this point they would have gotten it, but not quite. Look at chapter 17, verse 1. The entire Israelite community left the wilderness of Sin, moving from one place to the next according to the Lord's command. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So the people complained to Moses, give us water to drink. Now, a couple things. It's like, didn't we literally just have this lesson? Like, it's not like water and food and something else. We're like back to water again. But notice here, this time, they don't ask, they demand. Give us this water. I wonder how many of us feel like God owes us something. We deserve something. God, I was faithful to you, and this is the thanks that I get. God, I did what you called me to do. I mean, listen, this could have been Moses. God, I did what you asked me to do. I confronted Pharaoh. He said no. He made things worse for the Hebrews. Now they're mad at me. I've done everything you've asked me to do, and this is how things go. I wonder how many of our prayers are, God, this is what I want you to do for me. God, give me water. Give me food. Give me this. Give me that. And a God who does what we want him to do is no God at all. If God does everything we want him to do, then we become God. Again, they fail to trust in him. But guess what God does? He says, Moses, get your staff. I want you to walk. You will see me standing on a rock. And then I want you to smack that rock with a stick, and water will come from that rock. It's like this weird story, but he smacks it, the water comes, they have their needs met. And it's important to note, they failed all three tests, and yet God still blessed them. Do not confuse God's blessing with God's acceptance. See, sometimes we don't understand, well, why are things working out for them? I'm being faithful to God, but then they're getting the blessing. Listen, God blesses all of us, whether we deserve it or not. Jesus says he causes it to rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The sun rises on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's this idea that God will bless us. Never confuse God's blessing in our lives is that he's accepting everything that we're doing. But God's blessing is just another example of his faithfulness to us. It's at this point, I do want to throw it open to Q&A. If we have any questions, you can raise your hand. And if not, that's fine too. All right. So what's interesting to me in this story, there's like a whole big chart I wanted to show you where these three, like everything leading up to Sinai, the exact same thing happens as they leave Sinai in the reverse order. So like they're going to have these same three tests again, And guess what? They're going to fail again. And that time it actually says like God gets angry with them for failing the test again. And so we kind of see this symmetry. But there's another place where we see somebody who's in this liminal space, who's going through a period of testing, and that's Jesus. I mean, think about the story of Jesus' baptism, right? Like he goes into the water, and as he comes out of the water, the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and he hears his Father say, "This is my Son, and I'm pleased with him." Like, I mean, talk about like spiritual mountaintop moment to hear God say, "You are my child, and I'm pleased with you." Like this is a significant moment. Jesus, the Spirit is coming on Jesus to empower him for ministry. It's like this distinct turn. He's about to begin ministry. In the same way the Israelites came through the water, God was about to do something new through them. And in the same way, the first thing he did was test, find out what's true. It says the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness for a period of testing. And he's going to test, does Jesus actually believe that he is my Son and I'm pleased with him? And so he's in the wilderness not for 40 years like the Israelites, but for 40 days. And it says that at the end he was hungry, but in his hunger did he complain? In his hunger did he demand things? No, in his hunger he depended on God. And the enemy shows up and plays off this hunger and says, "I know you got to be hungry. Why don't you just turn these stones into bread and eat?" And instead of Jesus trying to take control of the situation, he quotes from Deuteronomy, which is the second time that the Israelites go through these 3 tests. And he says, man doesn't live on bread alone, but on the word of God. He said, I'm going to trust that what God said was true, that I'm his Son, he is pleased with me, and he will provide for me. The enemy comes back again and says, why don't you just throw yourself down? The angels will protect you, and everyone will know you are who you claim to be. Like, take control, Jesus. Like you can do this. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to test God. I'm going to trust him that he will elevate me when the time has come. And of course, the third test is, listen, I'll give you everything you want if you bow down and worship me. And again, Jesus trusts that what God told him was true, that he was his Son and he was pleased with him. And if Jesus was his Son, he would provide for him, he would care for him, he would lead for him. And for each and every one of us, I wonder today if maybe this is the day where we need to come back to what is true. What is your identity in Jesus? In fact, in just a moment, we're going to continue to worship like we do every week through a time of communion. And as we sit there with the body and the blood of Jesus, maybe this is a time, number one, to reflect on this last year, to be thankful for the waters that God has brought us through, to just sit in his presence and to praise him for what he's done. Maybe, like Jesus and the Israelites, you find yourself in this liminal space. You're not where you were, you're not where you're going to be, but you're in this season of testing, of stretching, and it's uncomfortable, and you know God is revealing what is true in your life, and maybe for you, it's an opportunity to say, I am going to find my identity in Jesus. I will trust him to provide for me. I won't complain, but I will worship. I will thank him for the thing that I prayed for, even though right now it doesn't look exactly how I expected it would. Maybe today is just a day to return back to him, and that you would know that you are God's child, and he's pleased with you. And so all across this room, would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're thankful that you do cause the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous. We're thankful for your blessings each and every day, even when we haven't deserved them. And looking back over this last year, I'm thankful for the ways that you brought me through the waters, ways that you have rescued me and provided for me, gone before me, did things that only you could do. I pray right now that this room would be full of thankfulness and praise, that we would find our identity in you. Because Jesus, at the end of the day, we just want to become more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.